Now the magic of Anua did not rest there, for the tips of Sedna's fingers became the little seals, the middle bones of her fingers became the deep sea seals, and the knuckle bones of Sedna became the terrible whales. They sat a moment in silence. The wind cried, the water lapped, the ice cracked and roared, and deep in the heart of the ocean they heard the songs of the hunting whales. Hello, my name is Virgil and this is Literally Books. Today I want to talk about Peter Tonkin's Killer. This was a book that I got from Paperbacks from Hell. Now, I know that I said I was going to read John Christopher's Little People, and I am reading it, but this book is the reason that I'm not done with that book yet. So you can blame Peter Tonkin. It seems like he should accept that blame. You know, you shouldn't write a book that was this engaging. Obviously, from the cover, from the cover, you can tell that this is a book about a giant killer whale. Yeah, it's pretty intense. And honestly, the book pays out on this image. This image could be like a picture from the book, so to speak. Really wonderful, wonderful art. I found out about this book before I'd read Paperbacks from Hell. I found out that there was a series, and I was like, oh, it was cool. I'm like, I'd kind of like to read one of these books. And this is the one that caught my eye, and I thought, well, I'm going to get one. I'm going to get this one. And I'm going to tell you that the impression that I think we would both have, all of us would have when you see this is, oh, this is going to be like Jaws. And yeah, that's an element, but it's also kind of like Moby Dick. And it's also like this like survival horror novel and just a survival novel. So it has like all these disparate elements that all get pulled together and make for a really well-paced read and a very easy and sort of fast read, if that makes sense. It's a book, one of those books that you kind of like keeps drawing you through. And that's what happened. It kept drawing me through. And I thought, I'm supposed to finish Little People. I've got time to read it. And I didn't. I read this book. I was not disappointed. The setup for Killer, without spoiling too much. In fact, I'm not spoiling anything because if you read Paperbacks from Hell, it specifically says this in there, and I'm pretty sure, actually I know, in the very first chapter of this book essentially gives this part of the setup. So I'm not really surprising you with anything here. The killer whale, and actually, side note, as a segue, killer whales are not whales. And actually, I guess I never knew that. Killer whales are a member of the like dolphin and porpoise family, right? So they're related to them. They're very intelligent, and they hunt in packs. This book follows a killer whale who has captured one of his calf and sort of kept in this bay by the U.S. government and trained as sort of a biological weapon, so to speak. That makes it seem like it's going to carry disease, but it's trained as like a force to be used against like Soviet or other like U.S. Enemies in sort of military excursions, right? And so it's trained to attack people, to monitor people, to follow them. And it's trained with these sort of dummies these very expensive sort of animatronic dummies that they would dump in the ocean, and then the whale would attack them, and they would reward the whale with meat. And so it got used to this sort of very specific sort of key things that someone might do and how it would react to them. In an accident that happens in the very first chapter, when a commander comes to inspect this facility in this bay in the north, where these whales and dolphins and other sort of things like that are being trained, an accident happens, and they try to kill this killer whale, but fail, and it escapes the bay with this training and with a horrible scar on it, right? Okay, yes. And what I think is really kind of great, and Grady Hendrix mentions this in the book, Paperbacks from Hell, or was it in the introduction to this book? I don't remember. I think it's the introduction to this book, which is actually really also a really nice touch. And I think it makes it maybe a little bit more desirable than maybe an original copy of this book. Grady mentions in that introduction to this book, this is really an interesting villain because it's something that you are genuinely terrified of this whale, but you also sympathize with it because it has been trained. It has been specifically trained to target humans for specific types of activity that they would engage in and attack them and expecting a reward. And It also, not to mention the fact that because it was sort of like kept in this large bay and fed, a very nutritious diet, that it's much larger than any other killer whale. I think it's said that it's 30 feet larger than an average killer whale, which I don't know how big it is, but I mean, I think the picture is somewhat representative of how massive it is, because a real killer whale is big, but not that big. It's huge, right? It's like the size of a whale. This killer whale escapes, and it joins a pod out in the wild and sort of acclimates and becomes the alpha, the leader of that pack, being so large and just sort of capable. And it sort of adapts well and sort of like realchemates itself into the environment. Cool, right? Well, except the protagonist of our story, a young woman who has been estranged from her father for many years. Her mother died and she lived with an aunt, and then she went on to study the same scientific field that her father studies, which is sort of like Arctic or like Arctic sea life. Think like strange molds and algae and everything, and sort of this sort of scientific research. And she became very invested in that field and is actually now graduated from college and is actually very, very knowledgeable in that field. And so she sort of ends up joining her father on this Arctic expedition that he's going to go on, along with a number of other people. And this is sort of a scientific expedition. Along the way, she meets two other characters, notices that one of them has some very strange habits. And when they arrive there, it's discovered that one of these people that she is traveling with, that she's met on the plane to go meet her father, is sort of like has a past history with another younger member of this scientific crew who's also going there, and that their past history is very, very one of antagonism, and there's some old bad blood between them that is very viable, and both of them seem to have justification for the way they feel and think. On this flight to go to the location where this Arctic research is going to happen, the plane crashes, and once that happens, this clock starts ticking on everything that these characters do, because now they are in the Arctic on an ice floe, and their plane is not flyable, and it's not certain, even though they radioed away, it's not certain if help is going to come for them or not, because the part of the ice floe that they were on has broken away from the main body of ice and is now adrift. It's a very large piece of ice, but it's moving away from that location. And as the story progresses and various things happen, natural events, animal attacks, not even, and also just like the danger of like being on this giant piece of floating ice and how it's really not exactly rock solid, how it's sort of like rotting, and they use that word's used a lot, the ice is rotten, where it's sort of like slushy and sort of melting through. It isn't particularly thick, and they don't really know how thick it is in certain areas. And this ice starts to break down slowly over the course of the novel, and you realize that they don't have much, they're on a ticking clock. And in addition to that, help is probably not going to come because they've already drifted so far away in just a matter of days from the original crash site that it's very unlikely that they'll be discovered. And then you add in a giant killer whale who has a taste for human flesh, and that the characters in this plane crash perform actions which are triggers for this whale to attack. This book has got a lot of action. It's really like an adventure book, but it's got these like just really, like, I would say it's not exactly breakneck. I mean, it isn't as though the book is so action-packed that you never get a breather. You do. There's actually some great sort of peaks and valleys in the action, and then those low points when the action sort of, after some crazy thing happens, and a number of really crazy things happen. After those breaks in action, you get these really sort of great, like, little, like, factoids or like sort of lessons about different, like, survival sort of things that you would know that someone who lives in the Arctic or has been in the Arctic would need to know to survive. And those are really fascinating. And you also get like these really great sort of like kind of beginner's class and like Inuit mythology and beliefs. And all those things just sort of like make those low periods very interesting and engaging. And then the action starts up again and the whales have returned. It's makes for just a really great novel. It is, I would say, in the ending, a little heavy-handed with the Moby Dick imagery. However, I don't think that that takes anything away. I think it's just a little bit, maybe sold a little too hard. But apart from that, I really have no complaints about this book. And even that isn't much of a complaint. It's just sort of like, oh, I see where you're going with this. Like, okay, I know the story of Moby Dick, so I get what you're doing. Really a fun novel to read. Really, if you're a fan of adventure fiction or like sort of like Arctic expeditions or like animal attacks, any of that kind of stuff, any one of those, this book would be a great read for you. If you're a fan of more than one of them, this book would be an amazing read for you. The only like cautionary thing I guess I would say is I wouldn't exactly say that the book is precisely graphic. I mean, it's not like really trying to gross you out or anything, but it is certainly very realistic in its depictions of what happens to some of the victims of this whale attack. Although, are we really surprised in horror? I hope not. But I think there's a scene very early in the book where this pod of whales with this giant leader, trained whale, this government-trained whale, attack a much larger whale, and sort of like in how they hunt it. That is kind of a little, I don't want to say exactly intense, but that probably isn't too far from the mark. If you were to watch some sort of like a nature documentary and the camera just doesn't turn away, right, when the animal is finally making its final attack, if that is something that you just couldn't take, then you might find this book a little too much. Also, I do think that there is a incredible amount of like animals that are just like attacked in defense of this piece of ice that these survivors are trapped on, to keep it so it doesn't break down, so it doesn't like break up into smaller chunks until they have nothing left. And the ice, this floe that they're floating on, is the only real protection they have from these whales getting them. And so they often, there's different things happen, and they have to like repel other animals by shooting them. And sometimes it's like a freaking bloodbath. Just very visceral, I guess, in that sense. I don't think that it's I think that someone who is a really great animal lover might be a little unhappy with that. There's a lot of language, a lot of time given to sort of explaining why these things are necessary. It never seems like these characters, any of them, are bloodthirsty. This is a sort of like, if we want to live, this is what we have to do. It's just a choice. We can, I don't want to do this either, but if we don't shoot this animal, if we don't repel these animals, then we're going to die, and that's all there is to it. So I think it's sort of like put in an impossible situation, or a situation that isn't really desirable, and just sort of having to make the best you can of the situation. Highly recommend this book. Really a fun read. It's kind of a shame. I want to say that this book was released somewhere around the time of Jaws, the movie, I think. You know what? Let me make sure about that. So not Jaws, but Jaws 2 was not a very distant release from this original book's release. And it just sort of like, I think the similarities between Killer and Jaws sort of made this book sort of fly under the radar, or just sort of seem like, oh, it's just a pastiche. I don't think that it is. I don't think that it is at all. I think this book should exist in its own light and has merit far beyond that. I don't think that it tries to really do anything that Jaws is doing. Also of note that Peter Tonkin, although I am not familiar with his other work, has written other things. He did have sort of a struggle in sort of finding a writing career after this book really wasn't very successful for him. But I think he traveled a lot with his father in sort of like Arctic sea sort of environments. I don't know if his father was part of the Navy or what. I don't remember exactly from the introduction what it was. I guess I'll put that information on the screen somewhere. What I want to say about that is that there's a lot of obvious, like, intimate knowledge about Arctic conditions, and also like Inuit like beliefs. And I think that those are given a lot of really fair and good sort of like presentation to them, especially considering this is a novel from the 70s. This 79 is the release. So that's pretty impressive that there's such a fair-minded look at Inuit, and that the word Inuit is even used. I mean, they use the word Eskimo, but which is, I think I've come to learn, is maybe not a particularly desirable word to use. It's slightly insulting, or maybe more than slightly, I'm not sure. That some of the characters who are not Inuit might say those words, but that the character who is an Inuit, or the characters who are, do say like, well, I think they actually said something like, well, Inuit, actually. That's who we are. And I think that that's a really really great presentation. I really like an applaud there for Peter Tonkin to be like so fair-minded and it's like forward-thinking in his presentation and fair-mindedness to another culture. So pretty cool, pretty easy recommend, honestly. A lot of fun, definitely something worth seeking out. I will say that an actual hard copy of this book is a little on the higher side for a paperback book. The last I looked, it's somewhere around $20 or maybe just shy of that. That's not crazy money, but it is a little high for a paperback book. But I think what you're getting here is you're getting a reissue of a book, a really great introduction by Grady Hendrix, and then also just this sort of like revamped cover that is just amazing. This is the kind of book that, like, if you have it on your bookshelf, you turn it so it faces outwards. You'd be like, oh my God, what is this book? You're like, yeah, it's pretty cool, isn't it? My brother-in-law is a huge horror fan, and I was telling him about this book, Paperbacks from Hell, and I'm like, yeah, I picked this book up, and I showed him the cover to Killer, and he was like, oh, that is pretty cool. Coming from someone who is a major horror fan, specifically in movies, so it's pretty cool to hear that, like, I'm sort of validated in my, like, how impressed I am in the cover of this, so that I necessarily needed the invalidation. Go find that book. You can also get it in an ebook format. That I know of, there's no audiobook right now, so that's okay. There are workarounds for audio with ebooks. They're not great. You can have your like Kindle. I can have my Kindle be read to me by the robot voice that my phone provides. Some people can't stand that. It doesn't bother me a whole lot, although certainly it seems like with the technology we have now, we can do better than the really lackluster sort of read the screen to me that we've got so far in our like phone technology. It seems pretty pitiful. That's a completely separate conversation. Thanks very much for watching. My name is Virgil. This is Literally Books. Consider liking and subscribing if you're interested in or enjoy the things that I do. And I'll see you next time. Bye.